So the next slide that was moving on is just kind of looking at some overall sleep statistics and then thinking about how we would evaluate that situation with respect to the legal profession. And so in general, it's looking like we're arguably the general population that we're the most sleep deprived generation or two, maybe three in human history. Like, a lot of it has to do with work schedules and technologies and everything like that. But when surveyed, the best estimate is at least a third are under an acute and or chronic sleep deprivation. And really, most of the time when you look at research and things that are looked at, sleep deprivation is generally looked at about 1 to 2 hours less than what's ideal for a given phase of life. And then when you look at the legal profession, on average, people are hovering, a larger percentage are hovering much lower than the general population. One of my research assistants was doing some digging. She saw that not too long ago, I believe the American Bar Association was really emphasizing health and wellness, and saw that sleep was a problem. And I think in the last 20 to 30 years, as far as we can tell, not an expert in the legal domain, but that there's been a growing number of sleeping lawyer cases and civil action and defense. So next slide.
Slide number 5.
So slide number 5. And so thinking about putting these statistics up, just sort of wanting to touch on, okay, look, it's a problem not just in the general population, but I think when you look at the ranking of most sleep deprived professions, the legal profession is, depending on where you look, I think it's within the top 5 or 6 in most of those studies and surveys. And so you start to think about sleep, what it is, what it does. And I think before we get on to sort of talking more in depth about sleep, I think it's important to think about what makes it so important from the standpoint of what's happening in the body. And really that kind of starts and ends with the brain, if you're thinking about where the big return and where the priority is. So as I stated in the objectives, what I wanted to do was talk for a few minutes on the brain. So basically, this is slide 5. So the brain is essentially the master organ. It's the computer and the battery for the body. 1 to 3 pounds, mostly fat. And if you want to have a kind of a picture of what the brain really is, it's really like a ball or a globe of tofu. Okay, well, sorry, could you go to slide 5, please? Yeah.
There we go. So
it's like a globe of tofu sitting in a little bit of liquid within a bowl, the skull. And that the tofu really is a network of anywhere from, depending on where you look, 80 to 100 billion neurons. And these neurons, each of them, we're pretty sure they connect with at least 1,000 others, and in some areas of the brain, much more. So you get a sense of it's this complex set of wiring and networks that are constantly monitoring and processing information. Most of us are familiar, because we've been talking the last 40 or 50 years about neurotransmitters. There's been over 100 identified. But really, the primary way in which the brain, as the master organ, communicates and connects is electrical activity, brainwaves. So, and there's generally 5 categories, moving from slow to fast: delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma. And these brainwaves are measured in hertz. If you think about radio waves, 99.9, I believe those are megahertz. The brain waves function, still on slide 5, sorry. The brain waves are measured in cycles per second. So delta waves are slow, mostly associated with sleep, and we'll talk more about this. And then beta and gamma are mostly daytime and are involved in electrical processing and passing information. And the speed at which this is occurring in the brain is about anywhere from 2 to 200 miles per hour, just to kind of give you an idea of the energy that's being used, energy that's being processed, The brain's about 5% of our body weight and uses about 25% of resources. So next slide. So this is just an example of how we read the way in which the brain senses, connects, and relays information. The picture on the left is basically a layout over time of brainwave activity, and each of those lines represents a region of the brain. And then the graph on the right just kind of gives you a look at what the hertz, the frequency, or cycles per second. So gamma, that's usually those are the fastest brain waves. That's usually occurring during daytime, during times of stress and or intense problem solving, as well as beta. Alpha is thought to be sort of the calm, relaxed, focused, connected state within the brain, and then delta, theta, for those of you that are already tracking your sleep at home with various wearables. Theta waves are largely seen when the brain or neurons are in light sleep or really good meditators. And then delta waves are strongly associated and most often found when the brain is in deep sleep. Next slide. So you have the brain. We have this complex fatty tissue of neural networks, like a computer and a simultaneous battery. And the brain is basically connected to every system in the body. And I'll show you a few pictures here in a second, but basically it's touching every system and involved. And when it's optimally rested and connected, it does a really good job of simultaneously, monitoring the basics of, oxygen, calories, and blood and immune delivery, as well as monitoring all of the various systems that are super important for your overall health and functioning. You look at diabetes and thyroid issues, growth and recovery, stress, cortisol. Chemical signaling, but it's primarily governed by the fastest form of communication within the body, and that's electrophysiology. And so next slide. So here's a look at what these neurons look like. And I put up a few slides here so that you could see some basic depictions of this whole brain body connection. When I was training, over 20 years ago, we were more looking at it like mind body. So as time has evolved and we've really looked at neurophysiology and neuroscience, realize it's actually brain body. And if you think about the tentacles and how all this is regulated, gives you a good sense of how linked and how things, when the brain is optimally functioning, things can go well all over the body. And when it's off, people can get all sorts of symptoms, from muscular to pain to organ issues to diabetes and all the different systems that it's connected to. So there's 100 billion neurons, each connected to 1,000. And then there are these long trains of nerves that travel out from the brain and the spinal cord that then get all the way down to your toe. And the electrical impulses that sense and govern, again, are upwards of over 200 miles per hour. And I believe when they've measured the overall length of nerves in the body, it's about 45 miles of peripheral nerves extending from the brain and spinal cord. Next slide. So here's another look, and I believe I put this slide in here. So I want you to look at the middle picture here of the brain and the nerves that are extending out here, and look closely at within what looks like the chest cavity. And you'll see that there's those two nerves that are dangling down. There's more than two, but this is kind of a summary. And look down just below that, and you'll see a couple that are coming up. Looks like they're coming up from the bottom within that same chest cavity, so near the abdomen. And this is important because many people will have functional abdominal pain, irritable bowel, gut issues, palpitations, all these things, and some folks, the problem is actually arising within that end organ, say the heart or the gut, And then in some folks, we see a lot of the problem is actually because the connection and communication from brain, heart, and brain gut is off. So this neurophysiologic signaling and coordination play a major role, not just in your cognition and your mood, but also in your heart and gut health and other activity. But next slide, next slide. As I mentioned before, the coordination of signaling from brain to heart, brain to muscle, brain to gut is vital. And it's energy expensive, it's fast. The brain is largely connected to the heart and the gut, two very important systems, through what's called the autonomic nervous system. There's two levers within the autonomic nervous system. The parasympathetic, which is like relaxation. So if you think about relaxation, so parasympathetic activity when triggered by the brain encourages the gut to relax and the heart to relax and slow down. And then sympathetic is the other way around. It's the fight response, it's the fight or flight response. And so when the brain is organized, typically these other end organs are organized and in rhythm and in a healthier state, which gives you an idea. Then you start to think about, okay, this brain, heart, brain, muscle, brain gut connection, as well as the other systems. The reason I'm explaining some of this to you, so you could have an understanding of, as we were moving forward, we talk about why do we sleep? Because from this standpoint, if you hang in there with me for a second, sleep makes no sense at all from a evolutionary perspective of the state we're in when we are asleep. Think about it. We're completely paralyzed, mostly not conscious of what's going on around us, which is fine now because we all live in our comfortable homes, relatively safe. But if you go back hundreds of years or maybe centuries, the broader environment was not that safe. And so laying down and sleeping for an extended time would leave you vulnerable to all the dangerous things that were in the environment at that time. So you, as someone who's been looking into this, you kind of start going through these different ideas of why do we sleep? How would anybody survive if, the saber-toothed tiger would pick you off, or the rival clan, or whatever predator or dangerousness is in the environment, because you have to go down for so long? It must be serving a purpose. And so once you have an understanding of, at least even on a simple or superficial level, of the brain activity and the level of cell activity and power and electrical activity and coordination, you get a feel for it. It's an energy expensive process. And it's so different than if you go to your CrossFit gym and you do an intensive workout. You need to rest your muscles. Why? Because they might be sore, they're fatigued. So what do? You rest them, and you rest them so that they can perhaps do it again, or just to mitigate pain. And the brain is no different. It's just the fatigue and pain signals, if you will, that the brain sends that it needs to rest can mimic all over the body. It could be fatigue, it could be headache, it could be depression, it could be anxiety, it could be just kind of feeling off, so I drink more alcohol, or whatever it is. So once you start realizing that the daytime activity in the brain is incredibly expensive and leaves a lot of byproducts, realize some of the current researchers out of Stanford and UC Berkeley often describe daytime wakefulness as low-level brain damage because of all this cell turnover and activity. And so once you jump from that standpoint, you really get a sense of, okay, now I get it. Sleep. The sleep is necessary in order for this vital organ to do its job, go down, rest, learn from the day before, and then show up the next day and do it again. Next slide, please. So what is sleep? As I was just sort of reviewing, it's a vital and necessary biological process for brain and overall body health. And the definition of sleep as it's measured is actually through the brainwave cycles and activity. So if you've had a sleep study done at a hospital, you may have already seen this or been aware, but essentially hooking you up and reading oxygen level in your body, heart rate activity, And there are also a bunch of electrodes on your head so that they can read the brainwave cycles. And so there's essentially, depending on where you look now, that's defined. There's basically 4 cycles of sleep. There used to be 5, but they've now consolidated non-REM sleep into 3. N1, which is light sleep, is when the brain transitions from a resting alpha brainwave dominant state to one where you start to see more theta. And then N2, and then N3, which most people are in pursuit of N3 and REM sleep. As I interact with patients in groups, everybody is into it, and for good reason, because non-REM sleep or deep sleep or slow wave sleep is super important. That's the usually predominantly the early stages of sleep after light that play a significant role in the overall flushing and cleaning and preparing the brain for the later stages of sleep that involve more REM. And we'll go into more detail about that. So sleep is important because you get, without these brainwave cycles that we'll talk about here in a second, you can get system breakdown, not just within the brain, but also downstream from that in all the organs. And a little known fact, or maybe most people do know it, is that there's kind of a rule of 3. So you think about the basic needs of the body. You can live 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, and 3 minutes without oxygen. And sleep is somewhere there in between oxygen and water. Is that the body starts to break down generally after about 2 to 3 days without sleep. It'll usually show up with some sort of disorientation and even psychosis. But the main takeaway from this slide is the definition of sleep is really defined by the number of brainwave cycles throughout the night, and in meeting those 4 to 5 cycles, each about 90 to 120 minutes apiece. If you're able to get those, then you, by definition, are getting good sleep quality. So next slide. So this is one way. The left half of this slide is really looking at a night of good sleep. So you're looking at the sleep stages. So moving from left to right would be when you're first falling asleep. The brain will progress, and no, I'm just describing optimal sleep. Or progress from that light alpha theta, then stage 2, mostly theta with some delta creeping in, and then the slow wave sleep is stage 3. So as we're moving left to right over time, you can see this gradual stepwise process. Then from deep sleep, we'll get into some REM. And now if you're sleep deprived, your brain will actually go and get the REM sleep faster than it should. And I'll touch on this in a second, but it's really important, as it's been looked at, that these stages of sleep occur within a reasonable order because there's different things happening within the brain during these different phases. So this first sort of 1/3 of this graph going from left to right, you look at the part that's rectangled in red there, predominantly slow wave sleep. And it's really important that the majority of the slow wave sleep occurs early in the night, because that's when the brain is essentially being cleaned and plumbed, flushed out CSF fluid to wash out some of the leftover byproducts, immune cascade, and proteins that are associated with things like dementia. But those things need to be washed out so that in that last 2/3 of sleep, you can see those red towards the top as the brain gets into more REM sleep. REM sleep is where more of the cognitive sort of learning and emotional processing occurs, and that's a quite active phase, even though the body is paralyzed. It's a quite active brain phase of sleep that is necessary for ongoing learning, executive functioning, and performance, and is most optimally occurring after a predominantly slow wave sleep, a deep sleep, where growth hormone and CSF flushing is occurring. Sorry, next slide. So lots of ways to map the brain activity. And this is just one way that we look at brain waves. And so the middle graph there with the triangles, but won't go into too much detail, but this is basically, when we map someone's brain and it looks like nice triangle peaks from the bottom to the top, it's telling us that it's an incredibly efficient brain, well rested. So during the day, if it looks like this, it will predict healthy quality sleep. So and ways in which you can get this activity in your brain to be most efficient, like and look like this on one of the brain maps we do, is essentially research and clinical practice. People who meditate, people who exercise regular, people involved in meditation or prayer, and in quality sleep. So there's a bi-directional relationship here in terms of sleep, brain activity, and sleep. Next slide. So again, just to touch on this first portion, it's really important that sleep occurs in the proper rhythm. If you have, caffeine can disrupt that. Some people who have underlying actual sleep disorders can disrupt the order. So even though you're getting a good duration of sleep, it's not happening in the proper sequence and therefore not optimal. Next. There's another way of just looking at the steps that need to occur in order for optimal sleep, and with the corresponding brain waves. So you can see, takeaway here would be at stage 3 and 4, where you start to get higher amplitude, lower frequency brain waves. There's a reason for that, and that is there's a tremendous amount of neural connection and coordination that's happening in order to clean and strengthen connections from one end of the brain to the next. It's also thought that slow rhythmic activity within the brain is part of the clearing and cleaning process within the lymphatic system, or CSF fluid that is flushing through. And I'll touch on that here in a second. Next slide. So sleep, defined by brainwave cycles, needs to occur in order for optimal functioning. And why is that? Because there's these pivotal events that occur, like brain connections are restored and enhanced. This concept of neuroplasticity, which when we were younger, we used to say that neuroplasticity was gone after you were a child, and we know it's not true. It just requires, more detailed, stronger interventions to take advantage of diminished neuroplasticity, but still plasticity that can be accessed. So the brain is consolidating useful information, getting rid of non-useful. Those protein products, amyloid that are associated with dementia and dementia-like processes are being cleared out. And then hormones are released within the brain and the body that play a pivotal role in overall system health and well-being. Next slide, please. So this is a picture. So within the last 5 to 10 years, it's been described and finally discovered that the brain has its own lymphatic system, and it's called the glymphatic system. The G is there because there's certain types of brain cells that are called glial cells. And so this was an important finding. It gave us a better understanding of what's going on during sleep. So if you look on the left and the right, so on the right, they've injected tracers to see where is the CSF fluid. And the CSF fluid is basically hidden in the ventricles, which are compartments in the middle of the brain. And on the left, they track that tracer at night, and the CSF actually comes out of the ventricles. And these different stages. Next slide. A few more imaging techniques looking at looking at the comparison of sleep deprivation, again 1 to 2 hours below what you should have, and then rested. So you look at the top 3, looking at tracer activity that's left over in people who are running 1 to 2 hour sleep deficit night by night. And it may be subtle, and I think that's another takeaway with some of these slides as I show you some of these brain imaging techniques. Maybe subtle at first if this is the first time you're looking at these, and it is, and then over time as you get used to seeing it, you can kind of really pick out the differences. But it also points out that because the brain is so complex, and and so intricate. These subtle changes are big in terms of the net of how people feel and function. So if you notice here that if you're comparing A to B, you can see, if you just step away from it, you can see there's a significant greater amount of red tracer remaining in the cortex compared to this series of 3 left to right just below it. And so that's telling you it's another reinforcement of what's happening and what's not happening in the brain when people aren't getting enough sleep by an hour or two. Next slide. Now, I put this slide in here again, just another view of looking at brain activity. Subtle differences mean big things. Also, I wanted to throw this slide in here to sort of reinforce the idea that as much as we've spent the last 50 to 100 years trying to nail specific regions of the brain and try our hardest to tie disease or performance based on one area, we're finding that although areas are important, within each area, most of the time, certain cell bodies or neuron bodies in one area are connected to many others. So it's more of a network than it is, hard workers in one office space doing one thing, but actually members within each office space all communicating and coordinating at long distances within the brain. And so that's what you see here on the left. This is more of a diffuse increased activity during a cognitive exercise. And then that same cognitive exercise done in that same brain, and then looking at the level of connectivity, you can see it's significantly diminished compared to baseline. Next slide, please. Another look, same thing. We're just looking at a different way of slicing the brain now from top to bottom. The other one was from front to back, and looking at the diminished connectivity, the diminished volume of connectivity after lack of sleep. So what we're really interested in, next slide, sorry, what we're really interested in is these anatomical studies are good, but ideally what we're looking at is what's the brain? We know what the brainwave activity can look like during the evening, but what about during the day? And so here real quick is a look at relatively disorganized activity on the first and second, moving from the left, then another example of organized brain activity on the right. The first one on the left is basically correlates with months to years of sleep deprivation. So it's just not very organized or coherent. So it's like static. What's going to impair functioning in a number of different regions of aspects of people's lives. The middle one is more weeks to months of sleep deprivation. And then the one on the right, highly organized, synchronous, efficiently connected cerebral cortex is a well-rested brain. Next slide, please. So looking at the anatomical functional network imaging, looking at the brainwave activity, and these areas of the brain contribute different aspects of performance. And sleep's important because if the brain doesn't reboot, recharge, recover, then it can't show up and do it. So under sleep deprivation, the front of the brain, which is largely responsible for attention, concentration, working memory, decision-making, executive functioning, organization, study after study after study shows it's the most sensitive aspect of the brain to 1 to 2 hours of sleep deprivation. Now we know, I work with kids too, so we know that the underfunctioning or undeveloped frontal regions of the brain or frontal networks, it's part of a normal developmental timeline. The front of the brain is the last to develop. The brain develops from back to front. So there's a saying that we have, it's the last to develop into the 20, 25-year-old category, but then it's the first to pay under sleep deprivation. So, thinking about your profession and your primary weapon or tool is cognitive performance, sleep is beyond important for you folks and everything that you do. These areas of the brain also interact with deeper structures in the brain, the threat centers, the amygdala. And if the frontal temporal regions of the brain are not adequately connected and efficient and online, then sort of like the monkey or the dinosaur brain, the fight or flight amygdala will take over. So it's the difference between being calm, focused, and stable in the face of stress and problem solving versus looking dysregulated, anxious, and impulsive. And most of that is mediated time and time again by the quality and quantity of sleep. Next page, or next slide, please. And then longevity wise, there's very few levers that you can pull in your life on a day-to-day basis that will give you the return over an 80, 90-year life in terms of not just quantity, but quality. Low sleep volume, low sleep quality is one of the biggest risk factors for hypertension, diabetes, stroke, addiction. There's a bi-directional relationship between sleep and addiction. And I bring that up just simply because as we were looking at some of the statistics in the legal profession, alcohol substance use is quite prevalent. And it wouldn't be that far of a leap to tie that to, on some level, the level of sleep deprivation that all of the hardworking lawyers are put under as they balance their professional lives and family lives. And then as we get older, we're pretty sure that in the not too distant future, we're going to see that lack of sleep quality and lack of sleep duration is either the risk factor or in the top 2 or 3 risk factors for dementia and Alzheimer's and other neurocognitive disorders. Next slide. So this is a look at the amygdala centers. So a well-rested brain is the one on the top. So that, again, another example of little changes in the brain can equate to huge problems. So the top 2 are the well-rested amygdala region, or well-rested brain, which would then impart an underactive, calm amygdala region. And if you drop right below that, you can see the highlighted area and how much more active it is, as indicated by the increased tracer size. Now, the amygdala is a dominant system when active. If it's activated by an external threat, the brain and body will immediately respond in a fight or flight response. You can get that same reaction even if there's nothing going on around by sleep depriving your brain. Important because, next slide, backed up more recently in a clinical way. In fact, just in the last week, there was some reports out of Berkeley. They actually looked at, okay, what does this mean? What does this translate to on an individual and community level? And they wrote a really nice paper, an article about how insufficient sleep is leading to us being more selfish and less conscientious of others, which, as we all know, is a big problem in general. Go ahead, next slide, sorry. So looking at sleep deprivation, cognitive impairment, all these things, can, related to you folks in your profession, can lead to personal and professional consequences, as we referred to earlier. And I know we're running out of time, so I'm not going to get into it, but we had a list of cases you folks you may or may not be aware of around sleepy lawyer, civil action, and malpractice. And again, it's a correlation causation, so we'll just say correlation, likely to end up strongly correlating with the overall level of sleep deprivation seen in the legal profession. On the personal level, next slide, I wanted to put this in here because if you look at sleep deprived, you see that blue globe there. It's a top-down look at the brain activity. It's a low power, slow brainwave activity brain that we see in people who are chronically sleep deprived. And then that map on the right is the way that we map the brain activity. This is what that begins to look like if people are chronically sleep deprived. And these people that come in that have this type of activities, all of it slow, all the way to the left like that, without the triangle peaks in the middle, strongly correlated and associated with neurocognitive disorders and neurodegenerative disorders. So on a personal side, this, not to use scare tactics or anything, but certainly paying attention at some point in your 30s, 40s, and 50s to your sleep quality and sleep quantity can go a long way to preventing this type of activity in your brain. Next slide. So sleep is super important because of what it does for your brain and body, and is likely to mitigate some of the risks that we just briefly touched on. It's also the only time that your brain is just purely focused on restoring itself. During the day, it's processing, it's monitoring, it's got one eye on itself, but it really needs that extra time of energy conservation to sort of clean, restore, reorganize, and prepare for the next day. So from that standpoint, looking at your sleep quality and quantity can be both prevention and treatment. So I think we have how much time do we have? A few minutes. Hopefully I'll run through these next ones. I'm sorry that I had the IT problems, but I wanted to get to some practical steps of how you could potentially optimize and evaluate your current situation. So first, next slide. First, looking at, okay, stages of life, how much sleep should I be getting? I was going to spend more time breaking down this slide, but I won't now. Just know that the number of people that can actually survive, perform, and be healthy on 4 to 5 hours of sleep per night, and the general population, when that number is rounded to the greatest whole number, it's barely reaches 1%. So I bring that up because in my career, we run into people and we tell ourselves stories that we're okay. And I think lawyers fall in line with most professionals where, you know, most of you folks are hardworking professionals that don't complain, and it's not a problem until you can't get out of bed and it's completely debilitating. The issue with sleep and not getting enough or enough quality is it's really like a slow bleeder that's degrading your system over time. Encourage you not to rationalize. There are very few people walking among us that actually are in that category of healthy with 4 to 5 hours of sleep. The reality is we need about an 8-hour sleep window to get the 6 to 7 hours of quality sleep that allows us to get those 4 to 5 brainwave cycles. So please keep that in mind. Next slide. So understanding what starts the sleep process and what you can do during the day and night related to circadian rhythm and melatonin can go a long way. So melatonin is basically released by a small gland within the brain, and it is a call to action hormone, much like the starting gun at a track meet. So it's not actually going to put you to sleep, but it's actually a necessary initial starter that calls all the other regions of the brain to begin their reorganizing to get to sleep. And so one of the things that you can do to help restore and optimize your circadian rhythm related to melatonin and what needs to occur in the later stages of the evening is to get really good blue light exposure in the morning between the hours of 8 and 10 a.m., 7 and 10 a.m. There's certain wavelengths of blue light that interact with the eyes and the pineal gland that can help to reset. And the issue that you need to pay attention to is that contacts, glasses, car windows, and home windows filter out that light. So if you can find 10, 15, 20 minutes, you don't have to do it Mayan style and stare at the sun, but just being out and allowing the sun, your eyes to collect those blue wavelengths of light can go a long way over time to keep you in a good sleep rhythm. Next slide. We also do a good job of rationalizing that our circadian rhythm is different than everybody else's. But the reality is that our biorhythms have been forged over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years prior to social media and TV and electricity. So this graph here is to show you, so really for the most part, how we're all wired internally neurohormonally, and to keep this in mind as you try to optimize your situation as well as create the optimal sleep window, because what you want to do is you want to get the bulk of your sleep between the hours of 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. So what does that mean? If you get 8 hours of sleep and you go to bed at midnight and you sleep from 12 to 8, it's okay, but it's not near optimal because of the biorhythms getting the bulk of the best sleep is if you're going to bed at 9:30, and then you wake up between the hours of 5 and 7 because of the biorhythms and neurohormones. The bulk of that sleep is occurring between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. Next slide. So you want to start thinking, am I getting enough sleep? That sleep window is important. You need 8 hours to get the 6 to 7 hours you need in order to get those brainwave cycles. Creating a night-to-night rhythms is super important. And if you have a couple of many awakenings that last a few minutes, this can be normal, but if they're longer and more frequent, then it's something you want to follow up on. Next slide. The brain is desired, if you're thinking about not just daytime functioning, but also nighttime sleep functioning. The brain wants to form habits. And the reason why is because the brain wants to conserve energy. It has two primary mechanisms. First is to monitor oxygen, calories to have energy. And the second one is to conserve energy in the event that there's something dangerous, something that needs to be done. So it wants to form the neural circuitry and habits so that things are happening automatically and are less energy expensive. So creating a sleep routine rather than waiting for yourself to be tired over the long run can create the neural circuitry or habits, and you can basically train your brain to fall asleep better, stay asleep better over time, unless you have an underlying sleep disorder. So things you can do: get off your screens 2 hours before the start of that window. So work yourself back from 10 p.m. You can prepare your body to drop the temperature 3 degrees that it needs to in order for your brain to fall asleep. And it's counterintuitive. You need to warm your extremities to cool your core. And that's because there are vessels in your hands that need to vasodilate when they're warm, and that allows heat to dissipate from your hands and feet. You can lower your room temperature somewhere between 65 and 70 degrees. That will help facilitate that. No stimulating content or consumption before bed, largely because as much as blue lights and things that come out of the devices can be deleterious, it's really the stimulating neural activity that makes it problematic for sleep. And avoid well-lit rooms at night. Next slide. Do's and don'ts. Alcohol, it will help the lights to go down and you to feel sleepy, but it's actually ripping through your sleep quality. It's been studied extensively. And while it may help people feel drowsy and go to sleep, the quality of sleep is just not there. And so, I live in the real world. I guess I'll have to say my experience, and don't take this as medical advice because I don't want to get sued. But, people are going to drink. And so the way that I look at how to navigate that is just drink less and drink earlier, no later than 4 or 5. It actually should be a little bit sooner than that, earlier in the day, because it needs to wash out of your system so it's not there in the evening and preventing you from getting good quality sleep. Caffeine has a really long half-life. So if you're having it after 12 noon, 1, that's a sign that your sleep isn't as good as it should be. And 2, it's also going to still be there stimulating. And although you may be tired and go to sleep, the caffeine is actually impacting the neuronal brainwave activity and preventing deep quality sleep. Don't work out 2 hours before bedtime. Work out much earlier in the day, just mostly because of the body heat, and the body and brain need to cool down in order to sleep. Next slide. Techniques that can be helpful. They're all number ones. In meditation, prayer, exercise, progressive muscle relaxation. There's lots of apps out there. And what we're finding is the value here is that if you remember those brainwave maps with the tall peaks, triangles, is that all of these things create a calm, efficient, connected state in your brain. So that can help to firm and make quality connections during the day. And also, if you're doing it in the evening before you go to bed, it will set your brain up for a natural transition, an easier transition of deep sleep. Next slide. Talk to your, if you're really trying to pull this off, it's hard to do it on your own, because unless you're living solo, you have other people in the home that are doing things. So, if I'm thinking about one of the high yield tips that you can do is, get everybody else in the house on the same page with you, which is probably, could be a fight, not the easiest thing to do, but could go a long way in terms of creating this routine. and everybody ends up happier and healthier. Next slide. Basically, look better, feel better, work better, live longer. There's very few things that you can do is more important and have a bigger return on how you're doing and how you're feeling than optimizing your sleep quality. Are we running out of time? And then I apologize for the IT. We didn't get a chance to get through it. Usually when I give these talks, there's common questions around sleep aids and sleep tech monitoring. And basically, if you're using a sleep aid more than maybe 1 time a week, 2 max, it's usually a sign that there's something else going on. You should have your sleep evaluated more thoroughly and in depth, because again, most of these medications, if not all, are not that dissimilar from alcohol in that they'll help you fall asleep, but they don't really do anything to deliver that neurophysiologic sleep quality that is needed to maintain your brain where you want to. And of course, if you're not maintaining your brain, then your body will begin to break down as well. The tech's not quite, I'm coming from a medical perspective. The tech's not quite there. I guess it's better than nothing because you get a chance to get a data set over time. But in terms of getting the details of, are you really getting quality sleep? I wouldn't rely on that. I think it's going to get there. It's evolving quickly. But for now, I think if you have questions or you're not sure, you certainly want to get a sleep study. And so people usually ask, when do I do that? You can jump to that. So I think it's the next slide. The sleep study, yeah. If you're over 40 and you're not sure, get a sleep study. If you're over 50 and you're either not sure or you're sure, get a sleep study. Again, you need to catch these things that could be interfering with your establishing a sleep routine and sleep quality that can be identified within a sleep study, because if you don't, it'll come back to haunt you in your 60s and 70s. So I certainly would want to urge you folks, whoever's out there, if you have any questions or concerns about any of these things that we talked about, or you begin to try some of these techniques and strategies and it's not working out, that may be a sign that you should undergo a sleep study for more detailed evaluation.